colleagues, clients, customers, and friends from the industry. Welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us on this live webinar broadcast on the importance of healthcare supply chains during a pandemic. By way of introduction, my name is Ralton and I am Operations Director at DSV Healthcare. I have been with the organization for just over 24 years and by default in the pharmaceutical distribution industry for the same amount of time. With me today, I have three of my colleagues and fellow panelists that will participate in the webinar. First up is Annette Naude, who is our resident subject matter expert on imports and exports. Annette is the pharmaceutical and healthcare vertical lead at DSV RNC and has many years of experience in the pharmaceutical and healthcare supply chain environment. Annette holds a degree in marketing and business science. Next on the panel is Ravina Govender. Ravina is a pharmacist by profession. She has been involved in the pharmaceutical industry for the past 21 years and has spent 17 of those years in the field of pharmaceutical distribution. Finally, I'd like to introduce Tracey Glover. Tracey is a lawyer by trade and heads up DSV Healthcare's commercial division. Tracey has been with DSV Healthcare for 11 years and has 25 years industry experience. We would like to make this webinar as interactive as possible and as such have allowed for a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. On the bottom right corner of your screen, you will have a Q&A bar that you can click on and type in to submit your questions to the panel. That's right at the end. Getting straight into the topics for today's discussion, I think we're all aware that COVID-19 has turned the world upside down in a matter of weeks. Countries have closed their borders and the lockdown has curtailed the movement of people to slow down the spread of the infection. These two actions also throttle the world's economy and put healthcare systems everywhere under huge pressure. Ravina, could you take us through the immediate challenges faced by our healthcare supply chains?
Thank you for that question, Ralton. So even though there was no stop put to the transport of pharmaceutical product through the entire pandemic thus far, what we did see fairly early on was a vast reduction in the outflow of active pharmaceutical ingredient coming out of China and India. I'm sure most listeners are aware that these are two of the major producing API ingredient countries. Just to give you one statistic, 2/3 of the APIs used in the United States of America come directly out of China. So the direct effect of that was that without the APIs, there can be no production of medicine. And the Global Fund, who works closely with experts in these countries, say that we will continue to see this in the short to mid-term, and we can continue to expect delays of 1 to 2 months of medicines coming out of various countries. Annette, being our expert on the DSV air import side, would you agree that this is what you're seeing with regards to the import of active pharmaceutical ingredients into South Africa?
Thanks, Ravina. A large part of the purpose of lockdown was to prepare the healthcare system. So PPE was a very large part of that. So in saying that when COVID-19 started, almost all countries immediately announced that they will be closing their borders and flight availability and cargo capacity became a massive challenge. As industry leaders, we managed to find solutions which supported critical stocks such as PPE, pharmaceutical products, APIs, as well as medical devices to enter our borders. But we had to act swiftly because time was of the essence. The unfortunate thing was that all air freight costs were exorbitant and more than double due to the supply and the demand factors. And most large forwarding and manufacturing companies were battling it out to gain space and to secure the essential items were uplifted during the first few weeks of COVID. Due to governments allowing essential products to be delivered and non-essential goods to remain a non-priority at the time, it made it extremely difficult to get essential containers in ocean ports as well as airports. So in South Africa, we saw major backlogs at most ports, especially Durban, Cape Town and OR Tambo international airports. Terminal handling agents and forwarders alike had to work around the clock to ensure we found ways to store the non-essential goods and to alleviate the congestion to allow us to deliver the emergency and critical products. Tracey, what was your experience during this time?
Thank you, Annette. So even though the freight forwarders were doing their best to enable product to flow, the market had already had a number of concerns about product availability. So the first response we saw from the private market was a massive buy-in. Started approximately 1 week before the lockdown. And interestingly enough, the first buy-in was of vitamin C. The second thing we saw was the chronic medicines, and then thirdly, COVID-19 product. And they were buying not only COVID-19 product with a known COVID-19 impact, but also all those products that were rumored to have a COVID-19 impact. Approximately 2 to 3 weeks behind the private sector buy-in, we saw the public sector buy-in. And if you look at the statistics published by IQVIA, which is a reporting agency for the healthcare sector, they showed a 5% growth in volumes in March. From a DSV point of view, in March, we saw a 60% growth in volume. Ralton, perhaps you could deal a little bit more in a little bit more detail with that volume growth.
Sure, Tracey. So we have a graph that I'm sure that everyone can actually see. So what the graph does essentially represents our throughput volumes, us being DSV Healthcare. The left axis of the graph shows our output in terms of rand value. It's the value of the goods, whilst the left axis, yes, and whilst the right axis of the graph illustrates the volumes of quantity of product that we actually push into the market. The timeline on the graph runs from June 2019 until May 2020. You'll notice and you'll see on average, we push out anything in between 2 billion and 2.5 billion rand worth of product into the market, which normally equates to around 15 to 20 million units of product. However, in the month of March 2020, we've seen records of where the value of goods gone into the market was around 3.5 billion, which equated to just over 25 million units. And that's exactly what Tracey was speaking of when she spoke about the 60% spike in March. And this was obviously phenomenal and never seen before numbers for as long as I can remember and for as long as I've been in the industry. Annette, every crisis needs a response. In this specific case, there was always going to be an obvious and rising need for a range of healthcare products. How did the market respond? And also, was it able to cope?
Thanks, Ralton. Thanks for the question. The industry embarked on solution-driven projects, which included flying dedicated charters out of areas such as China, US, India. And one of the airlines that we partnered with was Ethiopian Airlines. The market was very open-minded about the solution, and the charter options were very well received, as everyone understood that these goods were very critical and they had to get into South Africa as quick as possible. South Africa has always been an importing country and heavily depend on customized solutions. Does that answer your question, Ralton?
Indeed it does, yes.
Ravina, how did manufacturers respond to the spike in demand for their products?
So I think at the time, the biggest challenge for the manufacturer, Annette, was having to ensure that the medicine that was available in the supply chain was distributed in a fair and even manner. And coupled with the fact of not knowing when their next shipment would arrive, I'm sure you can understand this was no easy feat. Where we were able to assist them was with our internal processes, such as controlled supply of medicines, batch reservation, so that regardless of the customer's orders that were currently in the system, we were able to help them route the medicine to where it was most desperately needed. Ralton, a nuance of this pandemic is the fact that there is a huge need globally for COVID-19 testing kits. In your opinion, how would you say that South Africa reacted to this demand for testing kits specifically?
Yeah, good question, Ravina. So in my opinion, and obviously I can be a little bit biased because I was involved in this, but I'd like to think that we responded as best as we could given the circumstances. In our industry, there's essentially three main players. Okay, on the demand side, we have the customers, and at the time, the private and public sectors their demand was over 100,000 kits per week. On the supply side, we have the manufacturers. And they tried their utmost best to get product into the country, and unfortunately could only manage to secure on average approximately, I think it was about 10,000 kits per week from their global counterparts. And it was literally, I mean, it represented 10% of the actual demand. I think that the issue of global demand far outweighing global supply for test kits has been widely reported. And the situation in South Africa was no different to what was happening in most countries in the world. I mentioned customers on the demand side and manufacturers on the supply side. Then serving as a conduit between these two spectrums, you had us, the 3PL. As DSV, we found ourselves in a unique and stimulating situation since we represented 3 out of the 4 manufacturers that were bringing COVID-19 test kits into the country. To set the scene, even though there was a shortage of test kits, and there was no holdback on samples that were being taken from patients and then being sent to the labs for diagnostic testing. And samples were being drawn at a rapid pace. To say we were in a predicament, I think that would be putting it mildly. We had international flights that were arriving once a week, usually on a Saturday morning, that were carrying the test kits. These were most of them chartered flights. After clearing, etc., goods would arrive at our distribution centers at around 4 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. Remember, we don't own product, we merely custodians of this product. So the QA checks and the WMS portion where we still had to receipt, stock, capture orders, processing, all of that still had to be adhered to. All this whilst a huge backlog of samples were waiting to be tested at labs around the country. And I think at that stage, the backlog was around 100,000 tests that needed to be processed. To add, during this period, there were no weekend flights between provinces, and all product was coming to Johannesburg and needed to be sent down to the regions ASAP. So what we've had to do is literally walk on water. Turnaround time from receipt to delivery to the furthest point had to be less than 24 hours. So which means the warehouse portion of it was, we had to do a turnaround in about 2 hours, and then drive times to the various areas like Cape Town and Mthatha, for instance. I mean, that took your normal drive time, 14 hours, 18 hours. And yeah, we managed to meet all customer and client expectation. And yeah, I think it was phenomenal. I think everyone played their part. Yeah, I think we did really put our best foot forward. Also, one of the things that we saw was that the focus alignment was first on service and then second on cost, which was obviously a big mindset change and shift in the industry, which was new to us. So. Tracey, the lockdown, which followed the outbreak of COVID-19, certainly put a stop to economic activity in many sectors. But there was also opportunities, and none more than in the healthcare industry itself. Can you tell us about some of these opportunities?
Thanks, Ralton. So it is unfortunate that pandemic does bring about opportunities, but there were a number of new business opportunities, and in some cases, prospective clients were forced to make a business decision to change service providers at the last minute. And in fact, there are 2 important business opportunities that I'd like to talk about. The first one is that from 1st of June, when we brought in level 4, the mines were able to operate at 50%. And one of the conditions is that they had to have proper safety standards and regular testing of their staff. Mines being one of the largest employers, testing of staff is critical. So we were appointed as to do the warehousing and distribution of COVID-19 test kits for that mining house. The second major business opportunity was, as we ran into lockdown, we were approached by NHLS to do warehousing and distribution of their COVID-19 test kits. They've historically done their own warehousing and distribution, and they were concerned about volumes, and they were concerned about their capability to be really responsive in a time of crisis. So they appointed us in terms of the Disaster Act as their 3PL. Initially, we were only doing COVID-19 test kits, but 1 week into lockdown, they also asked us to pick up the PPE. And so we're doing the full scope of services for them. Also interesting to note is that we had been wooing 2 large medical devices businesses for a couple of months. As we ran into lockdown, they had concerns about their service providers' ability to provide a continued service. And so we took on 2 new medical devices and diagnostics clients right at the same time as we moved into lockdown. So, I mean, those were obviously sales opportunities from a healthcare point of view. Annette, from an ANC point of view, did you find you had the same opportunities?
Thank you, Tracey. Yes, most certainly. We experienced great success stories. From an ANC perspective, we also managed to conclude significant business due to our quick response and the action we took from onset. The new opportunities we saw arise from COVID pandemic was not only pharmaceutical and healthcare business, but it also was companies who has never been participants in the pharma and healthcare market, such as IT companies and security companies. As you can see from the video currently displaying, our staff had to work around the clock, day and night, to ensure we meet the delivery deadlines. Right in the beginning of the pandemic, there was no masks available. We had to react quickly and we had to support the country. And as a result of our quick response, agility, and our charter solutions, we assisted various companies by importing charter loads of donation masks, test kits, and various other urgently required pharmaceutical products. This was primarily to support the health of every South African out there and also keep our healthcare workers safe. So Tracey, on that, clients and customers were either at either ends of this crisis. How did the customers react to this?
Okay, so as I said, I spoke about earlier the buy-in. That was the first thing. And then the second response was a lot of emotional decisions. You know, customers not wanting to sign PODs because they didn't want to use our drivers' pens, not wanting to allow drivers access to premises, etc. But those were managed on a case-by-case basis. Later on, we saw business closures due to defogging, but also 2 to 3 days, and then those businesses were up and running. Mostly, though, the entire industry has remained operational, continued to receive, operate, and supply their own customers. So I'd love to say that DSV Healthcare has been the only organization that has performed, well, we think we've performed. As a whole, the entire industry has really been on the mark throughout this pandemic. Ralton, COVID-19 has put immense pressure on public health systems around the world. As we know, South Africa was one of the countries that was commended for reacting early with their decision to go into lockdown. What challenges did COVID-19 bring to the South African public sector?
Yes, Tracey. So I'm going to speak of it more as the public sector being a customer of ours, as a procurer of product. You know, the primary concern was always the supply of key medicines. The public sector at the time, they partnered with the private sector to identify products at risk and plan them to manage. The National Department of Health at the time, I think, reached out to most of the private sector companies to get list of products and our own critical suppliers so that they could form their own business continuity plan. What I know that for a fact is that the National Department of Health, they're also monitoring medicine availability in the country, in the public sector, and what they're currently achieving is an 84% availability. That's what they've published, which from a supply chain perspective, I think that is good given the circumstances. Despite the limited procurement budget from the public sector, remember they budgeted as per norm for this year, like every other company would have, and then they had to do this big buy-in of product, which we've seen from their side, and they did do that. Unfortunately, there was a disconnect, and I think this is where one of the challenges comes in. There was a disconnect between the procurement side and the inbound volume side, because what we saw, and especially in the bigger depots, was that there was obviously shift work implemented for social distancing. There's limited receiving hours because of public transport and non-availability of public transport. So those are some of the challenges that we saw coming out of the public sector. But also, I think that they've engaged extremely well with the private sector to help them through this journey. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, Tracey, that's what I can share from a public sector. Is there anything that you'd like to add to this?
All right, so one of the challenges that manufacturers always have with dealing with the public sector is that public sector each province is allocated its own budget. And payment from some of the provinces is a challenge. There are provinces that are known to have history of delayed payments. And so you had a situation where you had provinces who hadn't paid or had large arrears, and then all of a sudden they were ordering 2 to 3 times their normal volumes. It raised a red flag for manufacturers around ultimately whether or not they were going to get paid. But ultimately, we are in this industry to enable access of medicines to patients. And in each and every instance, supply continued despite the fact that manufacturers had concerns around whether or not they would get paid in future. All right, so Ravina, from a logistics point of view, we are very people intensive. And so we face the twin challenge of keeping our people safe while at the same time continuing to service our clients and customers. Could you highlight some of the issues that we faced from a people point of view?
Thank you for the question, Tracey. As you rightfully say, while trying to wrap our heads around this pandemic and the effects it was going to have on our business, at the same time, we couldn't drop the ball and we had to continue to service our customers and clients alike to the same standards and levels as we always do. And I think where we were able to be successful here was that we tried to be ahead of the curve as much as possible. Before lockdown was even implemented, we sat together and we looked at all of our internal business processes and we put together our business continuity plan. We divided it into six stages, and then we said, how would we react at every one of these stages? How would our business be affected both internally and externally? So as you can see from the slide that is put up at the moment, when lockdown only began on the 27th of March, we were already communicating our BCP plans to our clients on the 16th. And I really feel that that was key to our success. We then continued to refer to this document as the regulations changed and kept it up to date. If I say it almost became our Bible, I don't think that's an overstatement. The other challenge was, of course, educating our staff, because while we were making all of these plans in the background, it was of paramount importance that they were aware of it, that they were trained on it, and that they were following it. So all of this had to be in conjunction with, of course, running our day-to-day operations. So we also had to enforce these rules very strongly, and we had to be very stringent around it to ensure compliance, because I'm sure everybody will agree that complacency was never going to be an option. And the way we did that was in auditing. I mean, being part of the pharmaceutical world, we all know that we are subjected to audits almost every week. And this was no different. We put together daily checklists, weekly checklists. We cross-audited each other, and we continue to do so just to make sure that there's more than one set of eyes on a particular business unit. So much so that when we had our first positive case within the business, it was merely just taking the process that had been drafted and putting it into action. Ralton, I'm sure you agree that South Africa is used as a gateway by almost all manufacturers to move product into the rest of Africa. How would you say that our lockdown, as well as lockdowns in all of those various countries, affected exports during this phase?
Yes, Ravina. I mean, indeed, South Africa is the gateway into Africa. We know that that's what makes us South Africans so special. More so into your southern African regions, with the neighboring countries, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Swaziland. To answer your question, and in a nutshell, the supply of essential medicines into Africa via South Africa was definitely curtailed. There were 4 main aspects that impacted the supply chain, in my opinion. The first one being border closures. Like South Africa, many countries in Africa actually closed their borders to the rest of the world. Some did allow for essential services and goods to come into the country, but most just shut down borders. Second one was flight restrictions. We went to having daily flights to weekly flights to some territories and no flights to other territories. So that also put a spanner in the works in terms of getting product into Africa. The third one was border delays. And I think what caused the issue here was that there were many different requirements at the various border posts. To give you an example, in Botswana, one of the first regulations that came out, so that was ever changing. One of the first regulations that came out was that drivers that want to enter Botswana needed to get tested at the border and wait for their results, and only on a negative result would they be granted entry into the country. And with our type of product that we actually transport, with pharmaceuticals, cold chain, temperature sensitive product, this was obviously a no-go for us, but luckily we managed to box cleverly around that. The fourth one was the International Trade Administration Commission of South Africa permits that were required for product to leave our country. So what government did was, and that's again to ensure that stock availability in our own country for South African population, and also to ensure that there was not this outflow of goods from our country into Africa, there was a gazette that came about to say that any product with a certain HS code, that's Harmonized System Code, that left the country needed to have an ITAC permit when submitting for clearance with SARS to proceed to border. And this also, I think it did cause some delays with getting product into the African market. And that's more from a healthcare perspective, from a warehouse processing and transportation. Annette, from your experience, from the ANC perspective, what did you see on your side?
Well, Ralton, we were faced with many challenges, such as border closures, which you mentioned, but also South Africa was not allowed to send critical supplies out of the country. So in certain cases, we had to source stock from Botswana, and we had to arrange dedicated drivers and dedicated deliveries to move critical product from Gaborone to Windhoek just to treat patients. We still face certain challenges. Freight gets bumped last minute due to aircraft capacity constraints. We are also faced with astronomical air freight costs due to the imbalance in demand and supply. But we always navigate through these challenges, and we seem to overcome, them as and when they arise. I think, Tracey, if I could then just quickly ask you, by its nature, crisis creates opportunity, and the pandemic is providing no different. Perhaps front and center are being reminded that there is no substitute for robust supply chains. Tracey, has this been the most important lesson that has emerged from this?
Thanks, Annette. So industry's learned many lessons, some good and some bad, but I'd like to highlight what I think are two key lessons that we've learned. The first is a very obvious lesson, and that is the importance of a diversified manufacturing supply chain. So we saw the initial risk associated with the fact that India and China are so dominant in not only the epicenter of API, but also other materials and manufacture. So what we will see definitely going forward is that manufacturers will diversify their manufacturing across a broader geography. The second thing, and the second key lesson that we've learned, is that this pandemic has reminded us that the first priority of a healthcare supply chain is reliable and safe product supply. Over the last 5 years, healthcare supply chains have been more focused on cost, and this is because there's been pressure from manufacturers around cost. And I believe that going forward, we will all be reminded that at the end of the day, we are here first and foremost to provide medicines to patients safely, and that secondly, we must do it at a cost competitive basis. All right, so Ralton, how will the pandemic change business going forward? What changes or adaptions do you anticipate in the short to medium term?
Yeah, thanks, Tracey. I think that's the million-dollar question. So we did previously speak of focus alignment being on service first and cost second. However, the reality is that this is exclusive to COVID-19 related goods and services at this point in time. We've already seen a financial impact on the industry. The first quarter unemployment rate results was published yesterday, and it came in at just over 30%. And remember that this was just before lockdown. First quarter of the year is up until March, so this was just before lockdown. my opinion, I think second quarter is up until the end of June we're going to be worse off because there's lots of unemployed people out there. Every other day, we get communication of businesses either closing their doors or rationalizing operations. This is unfortunate. It's an unfortunate turn of events, which will no doubt make the remaining businesses to be more cost sensitive. It may also be an opportunity to look at the historic overservicing of industry. We are in an ever-evolving industry. 20 years ago, I remember independent pharmacies being serviced up to 3 times per day. That's been taken down to once a day now, and we still survive. In my opinion, we are yet to see the true financial impact of the pandemic. The pandemic has definitely triggered an economic slowdown, that's globally. The short to medium-term focus for most businesses will be on cost containment, where CIPs and efficiencies and the like will be the key drivers. However, this will also give us an opportunity to test new service level agreements in terms of order cutoffs, delivery frequencies and the likes. And the recent lockdown has shown us that this actually does work. So yeah, I think in my opinion, in a nutshell, that's what I can say on the situation, Tracey. Annette, have you seen similar in the freight forwarding space?
Ralton, thanks. I do think that, we do see a massive decline with various airlines announcing layoffs of staff, such as BA laying off 1,200 staff globally. SAA announced closure of all domestic flights, limiting domestic cargo movement, as you mentioned earlier. Globally, various airlines announced that it would suspend certain flights to and from mainland China, leaving a major gap in the supply chain from an APAC region to the rest of the world. The greater demand compared to what could be supplied, the future is showing that customers will start leaning toward ocean rather than air freight. Due to the high air freight costs, moving towards ocean freight will require customers to ensure that they plan their demand better and that they allow for longer lead times. It is also important to consider the product lifestyle into, you obviously can't send temperature sensitive with a very short product lifestyle on ocean freights. So it's product dependent. And then, Ralton, you're 100% correct when stating companies have to focus on cost containment leading into the future. Tracey, what would you like to add to this?
So we're talking about adaptions into the future, and I raised something earlier, which is, again, I think that continuity and reliability of supply is going to be more important as a decision factor when you're choosing a supply chain partner. The other thing that I'd like to raise is the whole concept of diversification. In supply chain, they always speak about diversification as a risk reduction strategy. And in a healthcare supply chain, you've got either client or you've got product diversification. So product diversification would be consumer health versus medical devices, diagnostics versus generics. And then customer or client diversification is, do I provide the service for private manufacturers? Do I add in donor organizations? Do I provide the service on behalf of the state? And I believe that there's certain businesses that would have had such limited portfolios. For example, a supply chain organization that is only doing medical devices that are used in elective surgeries, they essentially their business would have been dead for 3 months. Whereas an organization like us, like Imperial, that's got that diversification of client and product, we would have been able to continue to trade even if some parts of our organization are quiet. So I think that that's going to be a key thought for supply chain businesses going forward. All right, I'd like to move on to look at another point. Ralton, from an infrastructure and business organization point of view, we've had to handle a significant spike in demand while at the same time maintaining service levels. What do you believe that we have done that has made us successful at this?
Yeah, thanks, Tracey. So obviously, disclaimer up front, obviously not going to share all the secrets or ingredients that have made us successful during the past 3 months. However, I will speak to what I consider the 4 main aspects that contributed to us getting things right, if I can say that. And I'm going back to the 4 things again. Remember, I'm a supply chain guy. We can only think like on one hand. So 4 things. The first thing for me was the planning. So the planning of, as Ravina referred to, the Bible, which was our business continuity plan. So historically, we've always had a robust business continuity plan, but that dealt with specific things like labor unrest, strike action, staff unavailability, system unavailability, malware attacks, that type of thing. It was a good base to start with. However, a lot of time and effort still had to be invested to get to the final product. The second thing, automation. This beast, the beast being our flagship facility, Meadowview, it's truly proved its worth. On some days in March, we quadrupled our average daily volumes. And for those of us who are involved in supply chain, you know, it's when you go to processing, it's like I always say, it's like a sausage machine. It's what you can only get a certain amount of throughput, and then that's it. If you want to increase that, there's no way you can do it unless you add in machines and things like that, which we unfortunately couldn't do. With this type of automation, all we did was just extended our our operating hours a little bit, and we managed to get through the volumes. And this ensured that all orders on a daily basis was processed in full. Again, the efficiency we get out of the automation is just phenomenal. The third thing, in fact, I should have actually started with this. The third thing, our staff. You know, anyone with a big enough checkbook can buy this level of automation that we actually have. I think the key differentiator for us, and which also gives us a competitive advantage, was and is our staff, specifically the quality and reliability of our staff. And you know, this is not something that happens overnight. It goes back to the relationships that we've forged and built over years and years and years with our staff, and it's shown its worth now during this pandemic. The last thing that I think we got right was the client and customer communication we put out into the market. What we established very early on during the pandemic was that basic communication around what was happening internally at DSV as well as externally in the industry was well received by the people that we were actually sending out, and we just continued with this year and still continue to do so. So if I could just think of 4 things, that's the top 4 that would actually come to my mind, Tracey. So I hope I've answered your question. Annette, would you like to add to this from a freight forwarding perspective?
Yes, of course. Ralton, I totally agree with the 4 points you just mentioned, but I would definitely add cross-divisional cooperation. I think that was most certainly key. The way that Air and Sea cooperated with the healthcare division, the streamline and the smoothness of the flow of product through from point of origin to the point of final delivery through your beast, as you mentioned, was definitely key for me. That's one thing that stood out. Does that answer you? Ravina, from your side, is there anything that you would like to add to this?
I think coming back to an earlier point that Tracey made about the fact that the nature of the business that we are in forces us to be cognizant of what's going on in the country and what's going on to our colleagues and to the public out there. And with that being said, we were very aware of the service levels that needed to be exceeded. As a quality person, you know, we don't believe in flexibility of anything. Things are generally very black and white. But even we could understand that there was a need for flexibility because it was extreme circumstances and everything could not be black and white anymore. So helping that and having long-standing relationships with our customers and our clients, we were able to think out of the box and understand what they needed, and then also push ourselves to our borders to make sure and help them achieve that. So that would be my comment.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that brings us to the end of the panel discussion on supply chain challenges and opportunities in healthcare in the past 3 months. We trust that the information and experiences shared has been beneficial for everyone. So as mentioned at the beginning, we now enter the Q&A session where you as the audience have an opportunity to put forward questions to the panel. As a reminder, on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you will have a Q&A bar that you can click on and type in to submit your questions to the panel. So,
Ralton, I see that there are questions.
Yes. So we have our first question. So question from Anonymous. Do you see this pandemic in any way fast-tracking the government's drive to implement NHI? And if so, how has DSV prepared for this? Okay, good question. Tracey, would you like to answer this question?
Thanks, Ralton. So it has been published that there are certain subject matter experts that believe that government is going to accelerate NHI. The reality is that there are two key NHI enablers, and this pandemic has not changed those. The one is the readiness of facilities to be able to handle the volumes, and the second is the financing. So much as people would like to be gung-ho and think that government is going to expedite NHI, I believe that they'll only do it when they've been able to answer those two key questions.
Okay, Tracey, thanks for that. I think it answered you to the point. Thank you for that. We have a second question. Second question also comes from Anonymous. You mentioned a few times how well DSV prepared for this. Can you give a few specifics on how you prepared and how you managed the spike in volumes? So if the rest of the panel agrees, I think I'm going to start off by answering this question. I think that I have basically touched on, I think, the four aspects that we got right. One of the things that I would like to add, though, is that as much as we managed to process a lot of volume through the beast, as I call it, with the levels of automation, remember that these units and these parcels still need to be delivered. And with that influx of volumes, there was no way that we were going to go out and buy a new fleet. And that's where it helped us to belong to a bigger group as being part of the DSV group, because while in some industries like the healthcare industry, we saw a spike in volume, in other industries, we saw a massive drop in volumes. And that's where we actually could flex up our own fleet to get deliveries done by utilizing the rest of the group's fleet. So I think that was actually quite good as well, and some nice synergies between the different divisions. So that really helped us as well. Okay, so
can I add just one thing to that? And I think that the key thing here was we were in as unknown waters our clients were. So we spent a long time consulting individually with our clients to understand what were the key things that were worrying them and what were the key things that they wanted to get out during this time. So I think we never ever went ahead and thought that it was just about us. There was a very extensive consulting process, and I think that also stood us in good stead.
Tracey, if I can also add from an Air and Sea perspective, what we managed to do was we managed to book block space with airlines to ensure that we have premium space and capacity to make sure that we get critical APIs and critical pharmaceutical products into the country. One very good example of that was moving freight from Frankfurt to Johannesburg in as direct as possible in absolutely the shortest frame of time. So it really helped us to service the market and stop manufacturing from, shall I say, shutting down.
Okay, thanks, Annette. There's nothing more to add to that. I'm going to go back to the questions. Next question coming through is from Jax. And Jack's question to the panel is, how do DSV get involved from a consultancy and governance expertise perspective for our clients? Well, Jax, we quite expensive resources. I'm just kidding. Tracey, I think you're going to be best positioned to field this question.
All right, so Jax, I'm not going to give you the answer you're looking for, because what our goal is as an organization is to focus on what we do best, and that is we're a supply chain organization. So yes, we have a lot of expertise, but our expertise is not in the provision of consulting services. What we do though is we partner very closely with our clients through certain processes. So we have an ongoing project team, an ongoing engineering team. We have executive and strategic reviews with our clients. And those are opportunities for us to share what we know and what we've learned with what they know and what they've learned. Also, what we must remember is we're a South African organization. And much as we might think we're fabulous, South Africa is always a little bit behind the global curve. And a lot of what we actually are almost drawing more expertise sometimes from our clients when they are visiting here, their global teams, their EMEA teams, they're here, they're giving us input on global trends, they're auditing us and giving us feedback. So I think, as I said, we focus on our key skill level, which is supply chain, but we do partner in terms of information sharing with our clients through the processes that we have in place.
Okay, thank you, Tracey. Jax, I hope that answers your question. Going to the next question, we've got another question from an anonymous. So there has been a lot of discussion around antibody testing and the possibility that these tests will identify if a person has had the virus and has recovered from the virus. Have you seen an increase in the volumes of antibody testing entering the supply chain? Ravina, do you feel this question?
So I think that it's still a fairly new field, Ralton, and to my knowledge, there isn't an antibody test that is available yet. I think that when one does become available, based on whether it's an ambient product, based on whether it's a cold chain product, it will be quite easy to just encompass it into the rest of our product profile, because for us, it's not really the nature of the product, it's more the handling of the product and the storage of the product and then the transport. So depending on the product profile that antibody test becomes, it should be quite mainstream for us to adopt it into our processes.
Okay. Thanks, Ravina. And also from an inbound perspective, what we've seen is, if I can add, we've seen obviously an influx of PPE coming into the country and testing kits, but not necessarily antibody testing. I also haven't seen that there. Thanks, Ravina. So I've got another question, again, comes from Anonymous. And Anonymous says, hi, I am pretty interested on how you are maintaining the safety of your staff. Specifically, you mentioned you are doing warehousing. How are you managing to do stock takes with your staff and maintain social distancing and keeping to time frames? So I think it's asking a few questions here. I'm going to start. Ravina, maybe you can just get your head around how we're maintaining the safety, and then I'm going to start with the actual operational processes, right? Being stock takes and that type of thing. So what we've had to do very early on, and this was part of our business continuity plan, is we've had to make sure that the social distancing was in place, the 1.5 meter. And doing that, if you work in a warehouse, you know that when it comes to certain areas, there's not much that you can actually do to distance staff. So what we did was we actually got staff to work shifts. That was to reduce the number of people on site at any given time. Also, and I think we're blessed in this sense, is that with our operation having the level of automation, you do have areas that you just have a single person working. Our highway area, for instance, you've got 10 aisles in there, and each aisle you just need a single person working in there, which was quite good. And again, the shift work really helped us, which meant extending operating hours, but not necessarily staff working hours. So from a distancing point, that's what we had to do. Then on stock takes, So our annual stock take is, I mean, we do that in November. But from a daily cycle count perspective, ours is a push type system. So we still managed to complete that by working the different shifts. So yeah, from an operational perspective, I think the key thing was actually getting shift work with minimal people being on site at any given point in time. Ravina, you want to maybe touch on the safety side?
Sure, Ralton. So I think we were overly precautious. We took temperatures of staff as they arrived on site. If there was any doubt as to whether they were displaying symptoms or not, we tested them then 20 minutes later. And if there was still doubt, we chose to rather send them home rather than to bring them onto the site. In terms of work areas specifically, obviously we issued staff with PPE, being a visor or a mask. We gave them sanitizer. We also gave them cloths to use at their workstation. So from the time they started in the morning, they would sanitize their own workstation, in addition to what our cleaners were doing during the night when the warehouse was closed. And then finally, I also want to say that where we did experience any confusion, we tried to limit that by restricting staff in terms of their workspaces. We're lucky in our warehouse, we have biometric access. So at the beginning, fairly early on, we identified that currently staff have free reign of the warehouse, and this could lead to confusion at a later stage when we had a positive case. So quickly we decided, and we told staff, if this is the area in which you are working, that is the area in which you are to remain. We designated walkways for them from the warehouse to the canteen, out of the warehouse. And in that way, when we did have our first positive case, we knew exactly the staff quota that we were dealing with and who all the first line contacts were. And that just made the subsequent processes that much easier.
Yeah, thanks, Ravina. Yeah, so that's a good point that you make on the route traceability and making sure that we knew where every single person was at any given point in time and the routes that they used to enter and exit the facility as well. Also, I think what was important was that we did the risk assessment from a warehouse perspective, a distribution perspective, where we identified high risk areas and low risk areas. And funnily enough, one of the high risk areas that we found was the smoking area, where so someone that's where you're at high risk is if you're exposed and you are not wearing your PPE, being a mask, you are at a high risk. And in a smoking area where people congregate, that's where you can't actually smoke with your mask on. So that was a very high risk area. So we've actually had to segregate smoking areas and create more smoking areas because we didn't want to obviously discriminate against the smokers. So yeah, it's these type of things that you don't actually think about. You would have never have thought about unless there was a pandemic. So yeah, I think that's all the time we have for regarding questions. And yeah, that brings us to the end of today's live webinar broadcast. Again, we thank you for taking the time to participate in this broadcast and trust that we have met your expectation in the information that we've actually shared. It's basically experiences that we've been through in the past 3 months. From all of us at DSV, take care, stay safe, and God bless you and your families during these unprecedented times we find ourselves in. Take care. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.